Hi there, guys. My name is Siobhan Fallon. Thank you for joining me for a talk about the battle after the Little Bighorn, the widow, the writer, and the man they called coward. So immediately after the tragedy of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the blame game began. There were accusations made against Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, and plenty of accusations made against the surviving members of the Seventh Cavalry, especially Custer's second-in-command, Major Marcus Reno. So Reno may have survived, but there was still plenty of fighting ahead for him. There were all sorts of newspaper articles, letters, books, and a court of inquiry held in one of America's most glamorous hotels, the Palmer House in Chicago, to try and find out what exactly went wrong that day, June 25th, 1876, that led to the death of so many of Custer's command. So let's look at some more details about that fight and what happened afterwards, and some really cool photos. Thanks again for joining me. All right, guys, most of you probably know at least roughly the details of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. I'm just going to review briefly what Major Marcus Reno's role was that day. And remember, he was Custer's second in command. So he was sent with 3 companies to charge the Indian village in the valley with an understanding that he would be supported by Custer. Let's zoom in a little. All right, so when Reno met with Indian resistance, instead of fleeing, the Indians sort of came up to meet him. He formed a dismounted skirmish line. Soon after that, they pulled back into a belt of timber. Not long after that, they all left the timber, or most of them, and rode to what would later be known as Reno Benteen Hill. And this is where they suffered most of the casualties sort of during that kind of wild retreat. That's up at Reno Benteen Hill is where Captain Frederick Benteen met with Reno with the 3 companies of his own, and Reno and Benteen with their combined 6 companies, plus the company that was with the pack train and the pack train escort, never made it all the way out to where Custer and his 5 companies were killed. So as we touched on briefly in the opening, keep in mind that the written word was the absolute method of communication at this time. So photography existed, of course, and it wasn't exactly a new science, but nobody was getting any action combat shots or anything like that. There were telegraph machines, but the telephone had just been invented. There was no video, no Google, but they had letters, lots of letters and books, and of course, newspapers. And these 3 people you see on the screen there all tried to use every method available to them to plead their particular case and version of what happened, what really happened at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So we have the widow, Elizabeth or Libby Custer, whose husband, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, was killed when she was only 34 years old. She also lost 2 brothers-in-law, a nephew, and many close friends at the Little Bighorn. Soon after the fight, Libby moved back to Monroe, Michigan to care for Custer's aged parents and kind of sort out all of the family affairs. We have the writer, Frederick Whittaker. Whittaker was born in England, but his father moved the family to America to avoid debtor's prison. During the Civil War, he enlisted in the 6th New York Cavalry, which was involved in nearly every major campaign of the Army of the Potomac. Whittaker was shot through the lung at the Battle of the Wilderness in 1864. He was a lieutenant when he mustered out, and after the war, he embarked on a writing career. And of course, we have Major Marcus Reno. Reno was a West Point grad who served in the Civil War. Reno spent a great deal of time in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is close to where I live now, and that's where he met and married his wife, Mary Hannah. Reno joined the 7th Cavalry in December 1868. The summer of 1876 was the Centennial Summer. while the 4th of July centennial celebration in Philadelphia was getting ready to kick off and celebrate 100 years of America, the Centennial Campaign was already in full swing. Now, the Centennial Campaign had a little bit of a rocky start with the March 17th Powder River fight between General Crook's column and the Cheyenne village, and I have a video on that if you want to go back and look. So Colonel Joseph Reynolds would later be court-martialed because of this particular fight, and by April, the newspapers were buzzing with the, quote, imbecility of Reynolds. More bad press was trickling in on June 30th when a story ran in the Helena Daily Independent about the Battle of the Rosebud under the headline, quote, Crook defeated. This article, quote, denounced Crook's retreat in the face of the savage enemy as cowardly. The Army, of course, objected to the story, but it was picked up by the newspapers in Chicago and New York. And of course, about a week later, right around that July 4th celebration, the world learned of Custer's defeat at the Little Bighorn and the death of about 270 members of the 7th Cavalry. The New York Herald called this a, quote, mismanaged, ill-starred campaign and a national disaster. Now, the United States Army and the Grant administration, which was already bogged down with charges of corruption, well, nobody was looking very good. On July 6th, General Phil Sheridan was reluctant to make a statement until more information could be had, saying it would be unfair to the memory of Custer. But by July 8th, he pronounced, I fear it was an unnecessary sacrifice due to misapprehension and a superabundance of courage, the latter extraordinarily developed in Custer. Others would not be so gentle. General Sherman said on July 7th, General Custer attempted a battle without reconnoitering the position, and he was too bold. General Alfred Terry, who had been in charge of the Custer and Gibbon column, claimed Custer was supposed to coordinate his arrival with Terry and Colonel Gibbon, and he defended himself, saying, I think I owe it to myself. Had the attack been deferred until Gibbon's column was up, I cannot doubt we should have been successful. Now, Terry didn't mention that his and Gibbon's column got lost and were actually a day late themselves arriving at the Little Bighorn. Colonel Sam Sturgis, who was the colonel and actual commanding officer of the 7th Cavalry, he'd been on detached duty in St. Louis, and his son, 2nd Lieutenant Jack Sturgis, was killed at the Little Bighorn. Colonel Sturgis accused Custer of being insanely ambitious and guilty of disobedience and of sacrificing good men's lives to win notoriety for himself. President Grant said, I regard Custer's massacre as a sacrifice of troops brought on by Custer himself. That was wholly unnecessary. Wholly unnecessary. Grant also seized on Terry's claim, saying that Custer was not supposed to make the attack before effecting a junction with Terry and Gibbon. Now, we always hear that the military was all cautious and they didn't want to say things that would upset Libby Custer, Custer's widow. They didn't reveal the truth about what Custer should have done because they were trying to spare Mrs. Custer's feelings. But if you look at those comments up on the screen there, I don't know. These guys don't seem like they're really thinking of Libby Custer, in my opinion. And also notice, these guys, that's pretty much Custer's entire military chain of command. So Libby Custer was probably having a very difficult time receiving all these criticisms. So who was defending Custer? For the most part, the newspapers were giving him a heroic send-off. Even the poet Walt Whitman dashed off the romantic, A Death Song for Custer, that was printed in the New York Herald almost immediately. but it was the Confederate General Thomas Rosser on July 8, 1876, who first leapt to Custer's defense from a military point of view. Rosser had been a West Point friend of Custer's, and he had also been a head engineer on a railroad survey team whom the Stanley expedition, including the 7th Cavalry, had escorted back in 1873. Rosser got to know Benteen on that expedition, but Reno was on a different expedition at the time, so probably didn't cross paths. In July, Rosser wrote to the newspapers, "I feel that Custer would have succeeded had Reno made any effort. Instead of as soon as he encountered heavy resistance, Reno took refuge in the hills and abandoned Custer and his gallant comrades to their fate." Major Reno was quick to fight back, taking his responses to the papers as well. Reno wrote to Rosser, "Through me, you had attacked as brave officers as ever served a government, and with the same recklessness and ignorance of circumstances as Custer is charged with in his attempts upon the hostile Indians. Both charges, the one made against him and the one made by you against us, are equally untrue." Journalist James O'Kelly joined the 7th Cavalry after the Little Bighorn and remained on campaign with them that summer of 1876, and he interviewed Reno. O'Kelly was originally favorably impressed with Reno and Benteen, and he attempted to help defend Reno against Rosser's accusations, writing, "Reno looks every inch a soldier, and judging from his appearance and temperament, would be the last man to leave a comrade in a tight place without making an effort to save him." But over the next several weeks, O'Kelly learned more about the battle. He listened to camp talk, and by September, O'Kelly wrote the first full investigative report about the Little Bighorn fight. His conclusion laid the blame for Custer's failure on the blundering of subordinates. O'Kelly called for a full and searching investigation where the witnesses will have to answer on their oath. Libby was paying attention to all of this. She had also been hearing from Little Bighorn survivors, including Captain Thomas Weir, who implied that there was a great deal left unsaid about the battle thus far. Weir would later write that it was his life's business to vindicate my friends of that day. Weir also wrote to the mother of Lieutenant William Weiner Cook, who had died with Custer. Weir wrote to Cook's mother, "With our cherished one's deliverance within our grasp, we waited breathless 2 hours for the order that never came." In August of 1876, the author Frederick Whittaker entered the fray. Whittaker, as we mentioned earlier, had been in the volunteer cavalry during the Civil War. At the time of the Little Bighorn fight, he was an editor at the Army and Navy Journal, and he had written some nickel novels, which is what they called them before they were dime novels. And he'd also written the manual Volunteer Cavalry Lessons of the Decade in 1871. Whittaker had met Custer once in 1875 at the offices of Sheldon and Company. And those were the publishers who published Galaxy magazine, which ran Custer's serialized accounts between 1872 that would later come out as Custer's biography, My Life on the Plains. Now, historians are unsure when Frederick Whittaker and Libby Custer began to communicate, and they often assume it was after Whittaker's September 1876 article about the Little Bighorn fight that also came out in Galaxy magazine. But there's an announcement in the August 5th, 1876 issue of the Army and Navy Journal saying that Brevet Captain Frederick Whittaker is requesting information from those who knew General Custer with an intention of writing a biography. So Whittaker was acting pretty fast from day one. How much did Libby Custer help Whittaker? Whittaker claimed that he went to Monroe himself and met with the grieving Custer family. We also know that Libby entrusted him with Custer's personal letters. The famous actor Lawrence Barrett, who was one of Custer's greatest friends, also went to Monroe to visit with Libby in October of 1876. Barrett writes about the suffering and poverty of the Custers, calling Custer's father Emmanuel a broken man, crushed and feeble, and Custer's mother was still in bed and dangerously ill. Of Libby he says, "Mrs. Custer at last appeared, oh, so changed! She was dressed in black with great black lines to her sunken eyes, and as pale as death." But when Barrett visited again later that evening, he wrote, "I learned to estimate the true strength of Mrs. Custer. She will aid Custer's biography in showing the world that Reno was a coward, by whose fault alone the dreadful disaster took place, and when the proper moment arrives, she will demand an investigation." Whittaker had tried repeatedly to speak with Captain Thomas Weir, but at first he couldn't find him. It wasn't until he had finished writing the book that he happened upon Weir in New York City, and Weir was there doing recruiting detail. Whittaker wrote a letter to Libby on November 28, 1878. "I feel no doubt that Weir will speak out when the fighting begins. He spoke out as free as I could wish him to me, but I was very sorry to see Weir as he was, for he cannot live long if he goes on at that rate." Less than 2 weeks later, December 9th, that's not even 6 months after the Little Bighorn, Whittaker's book was officially released. Also, on December 9th, Captain Thomas Weir died of what was called congestion of the brain, but today we assume it was acute alcoholism. He was only 38 years old. Whittaker's A Complete Life of Major General George A. Custer illuminates what Whittaker saw as a common understanding of the Little Bighorn fight. He wrote in his book, "Beginning my task with a strong impression produced by the official reports that Custer had been rash and imprudent, and that the conduct of Reno and Benteen had been that of prudent and brave soldiers, a careful examination has led me to vindicate the reputation of a noble man from unjust aspersions." Whittaker went on to say, "Had Reno fought as Custer fought, and had Benteen obeyed Custer's last orders, the Battle of the Little Horn might have proved to have been Custer's last and greatest victory." Whittaker, as O'Kelly had before him, called for the action of a court of inquiry, which will be able to call forth the testimony of officers. Many witnesses have been deterred from speaking by fear of those superiors. The nation demands such a court to vindicate the name of a dead hero from the pitiless malignity which first slew him and then pursued him beyond the grave. This might look like a lot of writing and slightly self-important that Whittaker, with Libby's help, would hastily throw together this massive 600-plus page book about the life of George Custer, especially when you think about Custer's own earlier My Life on the Plains, which Whittaker just lifted pages and pages and pages from to put in his own book. And today we think of Whittaker's biography on Custer, and we kind of assume that the whole point of it was to just sort of pin all the blame on Reno and Benteen. And Whittaker, yeah, he does blame Reno and Benteen. But if you take a look at Custer's contemporaries, you'll see that many military officers actively participated in crafting their legacies, either in writing newspaper articles or in writing their memoirs. That's a couple of books. And then there's a lot more, guys. These are just a sampling, the tip of the iceberg. The military men at the time lived in a very public sphere. They fought their battles both on the battlefield and on the page, and they knew better than anyone else that the pen was mightier than the sword. We've got Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, McClellan, Dodge, Crook, Miles, Hazen, Wilson, who was one of Custer's rivals during the Civil War and one of Benteen's favorite commanders. I talk about him in one of the Benteen videos on YouTube. The list goes on and on. Of course, Custer was unable to write his own completed memoirs. But Libby, getting involved and playing a role in this, was not actually unique. Henry B.B. Carrington married not one, but two women whose books defended his military career. And Elmira Hancock, wife of General Hancock, would write her husband's biography a year after his death. And Alice Baldwin also compiled and edited the memoirs of her late husband, Frank D. Baldwin, and had them published after he died. So these biographies, they were clearly greatly valued at the time and prevalent enough that it's almost part of the career trajectory of successful and high-ranking military officers. Okay, guys, back to our cast of characters, our little trinity. These three all had reasons for keeping their version of events alive in the press. Libby wanted to restore her husband's reputation, and she especially wanted to show that her husband did not disobey Terry's orders. Whittaker kept the pressure going in the newspapers, calling for that court of inquiry. He wanted to defend Custer, but writing was his career, and it was how he supported his own wife and 3 daughters. So of course he was defending his book and naturally trying to sell it. During the summer of 1878, Whittaker, frustrated that a court of inquiry had still not materialized, sent an open letter to the Honorable W.W. Cortlandt, Wyoming's congressional delegate, and that was picked up by the newspapers. In this letter, Whittaker called Reno a coward 9 times. Major Reno suddenly had another reason himself to try and clear his name. Just a few weeks after Whittaker's book had come out, we're talking January 1877, Reno was court-martialed for his behavior toward Emily Bell, the wife of his subordinate and a fellow 7th Cavalry officer, Captain James Bell. You guys remember our Irish friend O'Kelly? Well, O'Kelly had also written a little bit about James Bell during that summer of 1876. Bell and 2 other officers of the 7th had been on detached duty during the Little Bighorn fight, and they did not immediately rejoin the 7th after the battle, even when they were supposed to. So Kelly wrote that Bell and those who were promoted by the deaths of their comrades were the subject of unfavorable comment and contempt, and referred to as coffee coolers. In light of this, I don't know, I don't think it's a coincidence that Reno decided to act inappropriately toward Mrs. Bell. Either way, it shows that there was some infighting and division among the 7th Cavalry. And whatever was going on, Reno was found guilty for conduct unbecoming an officer. That court-martial punishment of 2 years suspension left Reno unemployed and maybe gave him a little too much free time on his hands. And Whittaker's open letter to Cortlandt seemed to have been the last straw. It was Reno himself who wrote to the President of the United States requesting an investigation so that the many rumors started by camp gossip may be set at rest and the truth may finally be known. President Hayes appointed a court to decide in late 1878, and it would begin in January 1879. And now the party really starts. I don't have time to go through every day of the proceedings. I wish I did. I love talking about this. But I do have another presentation up, guys. So if you want more details, please check out my Reno Court of Inquiry presentation. Right now, let's just kind of do a sort of quick rundown of all the fun stuff in Chicago. So first of all, a court of inquiry is different than a court-martial. A court of inquiry is kind of a pre-court-martial. A court of inquiry examines the accusations against officers or soldiers to see if they are serious enough for a court-martial to convene. This particular inquiry was held in Chicago at the Palmer House Hotel. The Palmer House also just happened to be the temporary headquarters for Sheridan's Division of the Missouri. 9 days earlier, there had been a fire at General Sheridan's headquarters, so the Army leased most of the second floor of the Palmer. You can imagine a young active duty Army officer might have been a little worried about sticking his foot in his mouth in front of not only Reno and Benteen, who outranked him and remained in the 7th Cavalry in leadership positions, but also pretty much the entire hierarchy of the Army. General Sheridan occasionally would just stroll in and show up for proceedings whenever he felt like it. Major Reno hired some big guns. The Assistant District Attorney of Pennsylvania, Lyman Gilbert. Lyman Gilbert was a Yale graduate whose family, Reno's deceased wife's family, knew in Harrisburg. Opposing Gilbert was Lieutenant Jesse M. Lee. He was in the 9th Infantry. Lee served as the recorder or the judge advocate. He was not a prosecutor. He didn't have a law degree. He was just kind of conducting the case for the government and supposed to like present all of the evidence. The judges were Colonel John H. King, 9th Infantry. He was the president of the court. Also Colonel Wesley Merritt of the 5th Cavalry, who was known to have a rivalry with Custer since the Civil War. And Lieutenant Colonel William B. Royale. He was of the 3rd Cavalry. Both Royale and Merritt were with Crook when operations resumed after the Little Bighorn fight and for the remainder of the Centennial Campaign. So Whittaker seemed to have got his wish, but he wasn't happy. The newspapers referred to him as the, quote, accuser of Major Reno. And Whittaker, he officially petitioned that he be allowed to take his, quote, rightful position and act as the assistant prosecutor for the recorder, Lieutenant Jesse Lee. The court denied this request. Jesse Lee seemed a little insulted by the request and makes this statement. So in the end, Whittaker's only official input in the Court of Inquiry itself was to put forth 7 questions that Lee asked another witness. Otherwise, the reporters mentioned how often Whittaker was like sighing and rolling his eyes and looking really frustrated with all of the events. Speaking of the press, they showed up like crazy. Originally, the court had ruled that the journalists could not take notes. Oh my gosh, nobody could record anything if they didn't take notes. So the reporters, they just worked in these wild shifts and they would memorize the proceedings and they'd like high-five it. So they'd run back and forth and in and out of the room, like trying to memorize chunks and then write it all down in the hallway or whatever they did. A few days later, Reno's counsel requested that the reporters be allowed to take notes after all, and fortunately the court agreed, which is really lucky for us, right? And history, because we have these documents. The stenographer himself could not keep up with writing down all the testimony. So he too relied on these newspaper men. And there were days that he would cut out like the entire column from the newspaper and just like paste it right into the official documents. So that's another great example of how valuable the written word and the newspapers, the role they played at this time. Over the course of the inquiry, and that means 23 witnesses and 26 days of proceedings, from January 13th, 1879 to February 11th, 1879, you loosely have civilians on one side and the military on the other. On day 3, January 15th, 1879. A pretty big day for the court. General Sheridan shows up. Lieutenant George Wallace takes the stand. And Wallace would set the tone for the defense. And then it's amazing. It's like it was scripted for a Hollywood film. The following witness was the interpreter, Fred Gerard. And he would contradict pretty much everything Wallace said. All right, so key elements of Wallace's testimony, which would kind of be the backbone of Reno's defense. Custer said he would support Reno. No one knew Custer's overall plan, and therefore they could only expect Custer's support to come from behind. Wallace said he did not hear any firing from Custer's part of the battlefield. Other than Reno and Benteen, Wallace would be the only member of the 7th Cavalry who said he did not hear Custer's firing. Even Godfrey, who said on the stand that he was half deaf, admitted to having heard Custer's firing. So this was a little bit of a surprising testimony for Wallace to give. Wallace, when he talked about being in the timber, he said, "We used up what ammunition we had, and we were surrounded in a bad position to defend ourselves, and we charged to get out of there. We had to go through the Indians, and that could only be done by a charge." Now, Gerard, the civilian interpreter, he would set the tone for the recorder. Gerard said that he witnessed Custer speaking with Reno, and that when they were in the valley, he saw Custer riding on a ridge above. "I saw what I understood to be Custer's command, or a portion of it, riding above us and moving quickly." And the implication was that if Gerard saw Custer, then Reno, or at least others in Reno's command, should have seen him too. Gerard claimed that Reno's column was in the timber for only 5 minutes, and that they could have held the timber if they were, quote, determined men. Gerard also said Reno did not disseminate any orders or warnings to the soldiers or told them to retreat, but that they left pell-mell and every man for himself with no trumpet or bugle call. The defense, that's Lyman Gilbert, fought really hard to discredit Gerard's testimony. Gilbert tried to claim that Gerard had unkind feelings toward Reno because Reno had fired Gerard once as an interpreter. But Gerard on the stand said that when Custer returned, he had reinstated him. Gerard also pointed out that he was still working at Fort Lincoln, so that was proof that he had been pretty good at his job. Lyman Gilbert also brought up that Gerard had Indian wives. He brought that up repeatedly in an attempt to discredit Gerard and to show that he had relations on many levels with, quote, the enemy. So far, I haven't really talked about Captain Frederick Benteen, because Benteen kind of just eclipses everyone else in every situation, and that's what happened at the Reno Court of Inquiry. Even before Benteen got on any stand and gave his testimony, the reporters were referring to him as anti-Custer. On January 11th, the St. Paul Globe tried to interview the officers of the 7th Cavalry as they were traveling en route to Chicago, but the officers were reticent to speak with reporters, except for Benteen, who had no problem making a statement that the Little Bighorn tragedy was, in my opinion, the result of Custer's own actions, and it is an injustice to attribute the blame to someone else. Benteen would remain a favorite with the press. The Chicago Tribune called him the savior of the 7th, as well as the hero of 1,000 fights and the joy of the ladies' hearts. And these photos that you see there are from 1879, taken in Chicago while Benteen was there for the Reno Court of Inquiry. And I love them. They're such glamour shots. The one photo of the two gentlemen that you can see, that is, of course, Benteen with his dashing cape. And next to him is Reno's lawyer, Lyman Gilbert. And I point that out because don't find or haven't found any photos similar to that with Reno in them with Lyman Gilbert. So it's kind of interesting. Where's the one? Why isn't Reno invited? I don't know. There could be a million reasons, but whenever I see that photo, I sort of wonder, and it makes me feel a little sorry for Reno being left out on the social events. So Benteen, he comes to court, he testifies. It's a full house, standing room only. There are more ladies in the audience that day than any other day at the Court of Inquiry. And Benteen will foreshadow Reno's own defense. He will emphasize that Custer did not believe there were Indians on the Little Bighorn. Custer had no plan. Custer had sent Benteen on a senseless mission when he went on his scout to the left. So Custer could not have expected Benteen's help at all. And Benteen thought Custer was dead at the time Benteen received his final order. And many people think today that Benteen said this to prove that, therefore, he did not have to obey that order. To the delight of everyone gathered, in a very theatrical moment, Benteen reaches into his pocket and removes Custer's final order from his pocket on the stand and reads it. Come on, be quick, big village, bring packs. There's, of course, a tremendous amount of testimony. A couple more things worth pointing out. Lieutenant Lee asked Benteen about his personal feelings for Custer. State whether or not you were on amicable terms with General Custer on the 25th of June, 1876. And Benteen replies, I was as amicable then as I ever was with him. And Lee says, were your relations with General Custer in accord at that time? And Benteen responds, the same as they ever were. Lee says, did you entertain a good or bad opinion of General Custer as a commander? And Gilbert, Reno's counsel, does not let Benteen finish. He objects and says this is outside the scope of the inquiry. And the reason I sort of bring that up is we talk an awful lot today about whether Benteen's dislike of Custer could have impacted his behavior on that day. And this debate will go on forever, but you know, Benteen's in the military. Did he just listen to orders? Did he behave the way a military officer should? Or did he let his feelings get in the way? I don't know. But it is interesting that Lee does ask about Benteen's feeling. Lee, who was a member of the military at a military court. So he might have been wondering himself. Just like you'd see in a Hollywood film, the best is saved for last, right? So Major Marcus Reno doesn't take the stand until the very end. It's very dramatic. Before that happens, the recorder, Lieutenant Jesse Lee, asks to read aloud Reno's official report of July 5th, 1876. So that was the report that Reno wrote about a week after the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Jesse Lee reads it into evidence. That report has Reno saying that he heard Custer's firing. Not only did he hear it, but he heard it until 6 p.m. on the night of June 25th, 1876. Reno also said at that time that Custer intended to support me by moving farther down the stream and attacking the village in flank. Now, Reno, he has to make a formal request in order to be a witness for himself. Kind of like the way he had a petition for this court of inquiry. He has to kind of petition to take the stand in his own defense. And that's Reno. It's really great. This etching in the very front, do you see the man with the sort of crazy mustache? That's Whitaker, who's writing in the corner. And then you can see the judges there on the left. And as you think about it, you can kind of recognize some of the Seventh Cavalry witnesses there in the courtroom. Anyway, sorry, back to Reno. So Reno, he takes the stand. On the stand, he says that his testimony that he's giving in 1879 is better than the report he wrote right after the fight. Lee asked Reno, in regards to the official report which was read into evidence, was it not made when everything was fresh in your memory and more liable to be correct than a statement made 2 years afterwards? And Reno says, no, sir. So on the stand, Reno says he did not hear Custer's firing and he did not know where Custer was. He says that Custer could only support him from behind, not by flanking the village. In my opinion, there was no other way to support me. When asked about the number of Indians, he says that his estimate in 1876 was below the mark. Some other notable comments. Lee asks him, "Did cowardice prompt you to leave the timber?" And Reno says, "No, sir. The position was untenable. It was the only means to get anybody out away alive." And plenty of officers support that and say the same thing, that they thought if they had stayed in the timber, they would have all been killed. Reno twice recites Benteen's final order, and twice he forgets the part that says, "Be quick." Lieutenant Lee asks him, "From the number of Indians you saw, did it occur to you that with only 225 men, Custer might need someone to be quick?" And Reno responds, "It never occurred to me at all." Reno echoes Benteen when he says, "I am convinced there was no command down there when I got out of the woods. They were all dead." And similar to how Jesse Lee asked Benteen about his feelings for Custer, Lee also asks Reno, "Did you go into the fight confident in Custer?" Reno says, "I had no confidence in his ability as a soldier." Lee asks, "What became of the wounded left behind in the timber?" And Reno says, "I suppose the Indians killed them." Finally, the verdict and the reaction. So the verdict wasn't immediately announced in court. It took the judges a while to put together their findings. And you can see there on the left, that is from Reno saying, "Please telegraph me the verdict of my court to Rushville, Illinois, M.A. Reno." The verdict was, "The conduct of the officers throughout was excellent, and while subordinates in some instances did more for the safety of the command by brilliant displays of courage than Major Reno, there was nothing in his conduct which requires amnesty from this court." Colonel Wesley Merritt, who had been working on the findings with Lieutenant Jesse Lee, said, "Well, the officers wouldn't tell us anything, and we could do no more than damn Reno with faint praise." Now, Whitaker, who has not been the most congenial person throughout the Court of Inquiry, writes this fiery, furious letter on February 26, 1879. He accused the Army leadership from Sheridan to Merritt of a whitewash. He said the Army was protecting its reputation, deciding it was better to keep Reno in the Army and try to hush things up than to cut out this festering sore. Whitaker also claimed that he made application for a further and fuller investigation in the highest tribunal of the country, the Senate of the United States. It never went that far. This was it. This was the last court case. Whitaker was, I don't know, there was no more fight left. Reno, on the other hand, said that he was very well satisfied with the verdict, as if he had written it himself. However, unfortunately for Reno, this was not the end of his problems. 13 months after the Reno Court of Inquiry, after Reno had been reinstated back in the Army from his last court-martial, Reno was court-martialed again at Fort Meade for conduct unbecoming an officer. This time the charges were from fighting with a subordinate to inappropriate actions against Ella Sturgis. That's the daughter of the commander of the 7th Cavalry, Colonel Sturgis. Do you remember him? This time, Reno was dismissed. Reno would spend the rest of his life trying to get back into the United States Army. He married a widow, and she would later divorce him and sue him for neglect. Reno died of tongue cancer at the age of 54 on March 30th, 1889, and he was buried in an unmarked grave. His first wife, Mary Hannah Ross's family, said there was no room for Reno in the family lot in Harrisburg next to Mary Hannah. In 1867, one of the authors of a Reno biography called Faint the Trumpet Sounds, tracked down Reno's grandnephew, Charles Reno. So here we have another example of an author, a writer, who understands the power of the written word, doing a little research and investigation of their own. So Charles Reno, somehow he comes up with this idea to try and get Reno's dishonorable discharge reversed. And that picture, the tall man with the tie, is the Little Bighorn scholar and researcher and author and just all around fabulous human being, Bruce Littick. All of you guys should go out immediately and buy Bruce Littick's book, Vanishing Victory. But yes, Bruce has the mustache, and he is standing next to Charlie Reno himself, Reno's descendant, and that photo was taken in 1981. So this guy, Charles Reno, the man with his arms crossed, he did get Reno's dishonorable discharge reversed. Major Marcus Reno was reinterred with military honors at the Custer National Cemetery at Little Bighorn on September 9th, 1967. Whittaker. Whittaker kept writing articles and pulp novels, writing more than 80 books over the course of his career. Toward the end of his life, he started becoming really paranoid and involved in the spiritualism movement. Less than 2 months after Reno died, on May 13, 1889, at the age of 50, Whittaker mysteriously died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. His family reported that Whittaker fell down the stairs of his Mount Vernon, New York home, and somehow that caused the revolver in his pocket to go off and shoot him in the head. Very mysterious. Sounds like something only a writer could come up with. Do you guys remember these books in the center there? How about these 4 military spouses? Well, Libby Custer would write 3 memoirs about life with her husband, and they have never gone out of print. Are the fetching etchings at the front of each of these books one of a young and lovely widow? Oh no, each one of them has an image of George Custer. Libby's memoirs were influenced by Whittaker. Whittaker had recommended that she write about her life with the general. Whittaker said, "Don't be afraid to write for yourself. It is through your memories that Custer's best traits will gradually and unconsciously expand to the world. Right away, just as you talked to me." Libby would continue to defend her husband her entire life, and her powerful friends, General Nelson Miles and General Edward S. Godfrey, were also very vocal supporters. But by 1926, Libby had still not forgiven Reno. She wrote a private letter to the gentleman planning the Little Bighorn 50th anniversary events. Libby wrote, "General Godfrey has sent me a copy of his letter to you, and I join with him in appealing to you not to permit any memorial of any kind to be placed on that sacred battlefield to so great a coward as Colonel Reno. I long for a memorial to our heroes on the battlefield of the Little Bighorn, but not to single out for honor the one coward of the regiment." Major Reno's name was not put on that particular monument. Libby remained a widow for nearly 57 years, never remarried. When she died, she chose to be buried at Custer's side at West Point, deliberately and forever in his shadow. So in the end, none of these 3 had the last word, which I guess is why we are still talking about the Little Bighorn fight. In 2012, Michael O'Keefe came up with a 2-volume bibliography, and that lists 8,482 total items. That's nonfiction, fiction, periodical entries, not including children's books, certainly not including movies, documentaries, Facebook fights, or YouTube videos, and are all about the Little Bighorn fight in some way. 2012, that's a long time ago. I can't imagine what it is now. So this is still an argument and discussions that we're having today. Let me know what you think, please. So subscribe, leave me a note, I'll get back to you, leave me a question, I'd love to respond. You see my books there, that's a really brief list. Now that you know we all have over 8,000 books and articles to read, you can appreciate how I have to narrow things down for these videos. Thank you so much, guys, for joining me today. I had a lot of fun. I have more in the works as always. I appreciate your patience with it taking me a while to put some of these up. Yeah, I'm looking at my notes. I think I covered certainly not everything, but an awful lot. So please subscribe. I hope to see you again. Thank you guys so much. All right, Gary on. Bye, guys.